You ever feel like you're standing on land that whispers stories from the past? That's how I feel every time I walk through my farmland. 600 acres of hills, fields, and meadows, all mine. It's not just dirt and grass, it's history. My grandpa gave it to me, and his dad gave it to him. Generations of sweat, laughter, and tears are buried in this soil. Some people call it old-fashioned or outdated, but for me, it's everything. The thing about owning land like this is that it makes you a little different from everyone else around here. Most folks sold their properties years ago. Developers came knocking with promises of cash and fancy neighborhoods. But I stayed. I didn't care about shiny new houses or perfect lawns. All I cared about was keeping what mattered most, the land. Then one day, an envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't anything special at first glance, a white envelope with some official-looking stamps on it. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, of Blue Ridge County. They wanted permission to expand their subdivision onto unclaimed county property. Unclaimed. I almost laughed out loud when I read that word. Did they seriously think no one owned these acres? At first, I thought it was just a mix-up. Maybe someone forgot to update the records or something. So I decided to go talk to them directly. I figured if I explained things calmly, they'd realize their mistake and leave my land alone. Boy, was I wrong. When I showed up at the HOA meeting, I got more than I bargained for. There was this woman running the show, Margaret Whittaker. She looked like she stepped straight out of a magazine. Sharp suit, perfectly styled hair, and a voice that could cut glass. She acted like she ruled the world, which, honestly, might have been true for this neighborhood. When I told her the land they wanted to develop belonged to me, she gave me this fake smile that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Hayes," she said, drawing out my name like it was some kind of joke, "your claim seems outdated. Those parcels have already been designated for development by the county zoning board." Outdated, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Lady, I've got deeds dating back 50 years proving I own that land. You don't get to call it outdated because it doesn't fit your plans." She waved me off like I was nothing more than a fly buzzing around her head. "Well then, perhaps there's been a clerical error. We'll look into it." Her tone said otherwise. She wasn't planning to fix anything. No, Margaret had bigger ideas, and somehow, she thought she could roll right over me. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about misunderstanding property lines. This was about control. The HOA didn't see me as a person with rights. They saw me as an obstacle. And obstacles, well, they tend to get pushed aside. I went home that night feeling uneasy. Something in Margaret's eyes told me she wasn't going to let this go quietly. What I didn't know yet was just how far she'd be willing to take things. Little did they all know, messing with my land wasn't just stepping on my toes. It was picking a fight with someone who had way more power than they could imagine. The morning started like any other. I woke up early, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise over my fields. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and wildflowers. It was peaceful, until the sound hit me. At first, I thought it was thunder rolling in from the distance, but then I heard it again. The deep rumble of engines, followed by the unmistakable crunch of metal tearing through soil. My stomach dropped. I threw on my boots and jumped into my truck, speeding down the dirt road toward the noise. As I crested the hill, the sight stopped me cold. Bulldozers were everywhere, ripping apart my fields. Trees that had stood for decades were being uprooted. Golden wheat stalks, ready for harvest, were flattened under massive tires. Clouds of dust filled the air, choking out the sunlight. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I slammed on the brakes and stormed toward the nearest bulldozer. "What are you doing?" I shouted, waving my arms to get the operator's attention. He climbed down from the machine, looking annoyed but not sorry. "Just following orders," he said with a shrug, handing me a piece of paper. "Work order from the HOA. You got a problem. Take it up with them." I snatched the paper and scanned it quickly. Sure enough, There it was, the authorization signed by none other than Margaret Whitaker herself. My hand shook as I read the details. They weren't just clearing a small corner. They were destroying acres of prime farmland, acres that belonged to me. Rage bubbled inside me, hot and uncontrollable. How dare they? Who gave them the right to come onto my property and tear it apart? I wanted to scream at the workers, demand they stop immediately. But deep down, I knew yelling wouldn't fix anything. This wasn't their fault. They were just doing their jobs. The real enemy was sitting comfortably in her office chair, pulling strings like some kind of puppet master. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the destruction replaying in my mind. The fallen trees, the ruined crops, the sheer arrogance of it all. I kept thinking about Margaret's smug smile when I told her I owned the land. Did she really believe she could get away with this? As the hours ticked by, anger turned into determination. If the HOA thought they could push me around, they were dead wrong. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about standing up for what was mine. I'd spent years taking care of this land, respecting it, nurturing it. And now, thanks to Margaret and her crew, it was being treated like garbage. The next day, I drove into town to gather proof. I dug through old files, pulling out deeds and maps that showed exactly where my property lines were. Then I headed to the county clerk's office to make sure everything was officially recorded. By the time I left, I had stacks of documents proving beyond a doubt that the land was mine, and always had been. But something still bothered me. Why would the HOA risk bulldozing private property without double-checking ownership? Either they were incredibly sloppy, or they thought they could intimidate me into backing down. Neither option sat well with me. Something bigger was going on here, and I needed answers. By the end of the week, I was ready to confront Margaret again. Armed with evidence and a fire burning in my chest, I marched into the next HOA meeting prepared to fight back. What I didn't expect was how far Margaret would go to protect herself, or how much she underestimated me. The HOA meeting was packed. Neighbors filled the room, chatting quietly while Margaret Whitaker stood at the front, shuffling papers and looking as polished as ever. She wore another one of her tailored suits, this time in navy blue, and her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she moved. The air felt tense, like everyone knew something big was about to happen. But no one knew what. I walked in carrying a folder stuffed with documents, deeds, maps, tax records, everything I needed to prove my case. My hands were steady, but my heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about respect. About making sure people understood that you can't trample over someone's life without consequences. When Margaret saw me, her lips curled into that same fake smile she'd given me before. "Ah, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "So glad you could join us today." "Cut the act, Margaret," I shot back, my voice firm but controlled. "You bulldozed 600 acres of my farmland. You want to explain how that happened?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to me, and I could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked curious, others confused, and a few seemed almost guilty. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then recovered quickly, smoothing her jacket as if trying to compose herself. As I mentioned at our last meeting, she began, addressing the crowd instead of me. "There appears to have been some confusion regarding property ownership. However, rest assured, all actions taken by the HOA are fully within legal guidelines." "Legal guidelines," I repeated, stepping closer so everyone could hear me clearly. "You call tearing up someone's livelihood legal? Because I've got news for you. I own every single acre you destroyed. And I've got the paperwork to prove it." I opened the folder and held up the first document, a deed dated decades ago, signed by my grandfather. Then another, showing recent tax payments made in my name. Finally, I spread out a map marked with bright red lines indicating my property boundaries. There was no mistaking it. The land they'd bulldozed belonged to me. For a split second, Margaret looked rattled, but she recovered fast, clearing her throat and turning to face the audience. "While these claims may seem convincing," she said smoothly, "it's important to remember that land disputes often involve complex legal issues. Until a court reviews the matter, we must proceed with caution." Her words hung in the air, and I could see doubt creeping into the faces around the room. That's when I realized what she was doing. She was planting seeds of uncertainty, making me look like the bad guy, the troublemaker who wouldn't let progress happen. It was infuriating, but also clever. Too clever. "You're stalling," I said, raising my voice just enough to command attention. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you sent those bulldozers onto my land. You didn't check records because you didn't care. All you cared about was expanding your little empire." Margaret's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Mr. Hayes, your accusations are baseless and inflammatory. If you wish to pursue this matter further, I suggest consulting an attorney. Now, let's move on to other agenda items." "No," I interrupted, louder this time. Heads snapped toward me, surprised by my outburst. "We're not moving on until this is settled. You don't get to brush this under the rug like it never happened. Not after what you've done." The tension in the room was thick now, almost suffocating. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to side with me or Margaret. For a moment, it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. With a calmness that bordered on eerie, she leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto mine. "Very well, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, her tone icy. "If you insist on dragging this out, be prepared for the repercussions. Lawsuits are expensive. Are you truly willing to risk everything over a few acres of farmland?" Her question hit hard, but not because it scared me. It made me angry. Angry because she thought she could intimidate me into backing down. Angry because she believed money and power could solve anything. And most of all, angry because she still didn't understand who she was dealing with. "I'm not risking anything," I replied, my voice low but steady. "I'm fighting for what's mine. Something you'll learn real soon." As I left the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't going to give up easily. She had resources, connections, and a reputation to protect. But neither was I. Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about winning. It's about proving to yourself, and everyone else, that you won't back down when it matters most. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's words. "Lawsuits are expensive," she'd said, like it was some kind of threat. She probably thought I'd back down, that I'd look at the cost of a legal battle and decide it wasn't worth it. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was just how deep my roots went. Literally. I spent hours digging through old files, not just for my own land, but for the entire county. My grandfather hadn't just bought our farm. He'd been smart. Over the years, he quietly acquired neighboring parcels whenever they came up for sale. At first, it was to protect our borders from developers. Later, it became something bigger, a legacy. By the time the deeds passed to me, I owned more than anyone realized. Farms, forests, even the roads connecting subdivisions, all of it was mine. And yes, that included the very ground the HOA headquarters sat on. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, fine. I'd show her exactly who she was dealing with. The next morning, I hired a lawyer, not to sue the HOA, but to send them a formal notice. It was simple. I informed them that their operations were technically on leased land controlled by me. Legally, I could revoke those leases anytime I wanted. Of course, I didn't mention this little detail in the letter. Not yet. I wanted to see how they'd react when they found out. Word spread quickly. People started asking questions. Neighbors who had ignored me before suddenly wanted to know more about my claims. Some were skeptical, others curious, but all of them uneasy. The HOA had always acted like an untouchable authority, but now cracks were starting to show in their perfect facade. At the next meeting, The atmosphere was different. Tension buzzed in the air like static electricity. Margaret stood at the front, looking unusually flustered. Her usual confidence seemed shaky, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. "Before we begin," she announced, glancing briefly in my direction, "there have been developments regarding certain property titles in our area." Her voice wavered slightly, and I leaned forward, intrigued. This was it, the moment she realized she'd bitten off more than she could chew. "It appears there may be discrepancies in ownership records," she continued, her tone cautious. "While we work to resolve these issues, I urge everyone to remain calm and avoid jumping to conclusions." Jumping to conclusions. Oh, the irony. That's exactly what she'd done when she sent bulldozers onto my land. Now she was trying to buy time, hoping to smooth things over before the truth came out. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how hard you try to bury it. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me. One was Mrs. Patel, whose family lived near the edge of the subdivision. "Is it true?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Do you really own all this land?" "I do," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Every acre." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded them they don't run everything." Her words stuck with me long after she walked away. For so long, the HOA had acted like they were untouchable, like their rules were law. But now, cracks were forming in their foundation, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Still, Margaret wasn't ready to give up. As the days passed, rumors began circulating about secret meetings and emergency plans. Whatever she was cooking up, it was clear she wasn't going down without a fight. And honestly, I wouldn't have expected anything less. What I didn't realize yet was just how far she'd go to protect her empire, or how much collateral damage she'd leave behind in the process. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point over the next few days. Whispers spread like wildfire. About me, about Margaret, about the land dispute that had everyone on edge. People who once avoided eye contact with me now nodded politely or stopped to chat when they saw me outside. It was strange, almost surreal, how quickly opinions shifted once the truth started coming out. Margaret, however, wasn't sitting idly by. She was fighting back, and she was doing it in her own calculated way. Flyers appeared on doorsteps overnight, printed on glossy paper with bold headlines, "Preserving our community." The truth about recent claims. At first glance, it seemed like an innocent attempt to clear things up. But as I read through the fine print, my blood began to boil. The flyer painted me as some kind of greedy opportunist, a man trying to exploit legal loopholes for personal gain. According to Margaret, my claims of owning vast tracts of land weren't just inaccurate. They were dangerous. Dangerous. How could protecting what was rightfully mine be dangerous? The whole thing reeked of manipulation, but I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to turn the neighborhood against me before I could expose her. And then came the town hall meeting. This time, the room wasn't just full, it was packed. Neighbors crammed into every available seat, spilling into the aisles. Some looked nervous, others angry, and a few seemed downright scared. Margaret stood at the front, flanked by two men in suits who looked more like lawyers than community members. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "As many of you know, there have been disturbing allegations made recently regarding property ownership in our area." Her gaze swept across the crowd, landing briefly on me before moving on. "These allegations threaten not only the stability of our community, but also the investments we've collectively made in our homes and futures." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in. Then she turned to face me directly. "Mr. Hayes has claimed ownership of significant portions of this county, including areas currently occupied by residents and businesses alike. While we respect private property rights, such sweeping assertions cannot go unchallenged." The room erupted in murmurs. Heads turned toward me, curiosity mixed with suspicion. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. This was her game, to make me look unreasonable, unhinged even. But I wasn't going to let her win. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, holding up the folder of documents I'd brought with me. "Let's get one thing straight," I said, my voice loud enough to silence the chatter. "I'm not here to take anyone's home or ruin this community. All I want is justice, for people to acknowledge the truth instead of hiding behind lies." I opened the folder and held up the deed to the HOA headquarters itself. "This building, the roads you drive on, they're leased from me. Every single one of them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Margaret looked momentarily stunned, though she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "These documents are misleading," she countered, her voice sharp. "They don't account for zoning laws or municipal agreements. They're legally binding," I shot back. "And if you think I won't enforce them, you're mistaken." For the first time, I saw cracks in her composure. She glanced nervously at the men beside her, then back at the crowd. "We're working with authorities to resolve this matter," she said, her tone defensive. "But rest assured, we will protect our community from baseless threats." Baseless threats. That stung, but I refused to let her rattle me. Instead, I addressed the crowd directly. "Ask yourselves this: who benefits from keeping you in the dark? Who profits while pretending to act in your best interest?" The room fell silent. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whom to believe. Margaret tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Doubt had taken root, and no amount of spin could erase it. As I left the meeting, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, frustration, but also a flicker of hope. For the first time, I saw doubt in the eyes of the neighbors. Margaret's polished facade was cracking, and people were starting to question her motives. But I knew this fight wasn't over yet. If anything, it was about to get uglier. The next morning, I woke up to find another surprise waiting for me: a letter from the county zoning board. At first glance, it seemed routine, a notice about pending reviews of land use permits. But as I read further, my stomach sank. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that my ownership claims disrupted community planning efforts. The complaint wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name to know who was behind it. Margaret was pulling out all the stops. She wasn't just trying to discredit me. She was dragging the entire system into her web of manipulation. And worse, she was counting on me getting tired, giving up, or running out of money to fight back. But she underestimated one crucial thing: how far I was willing to go to protect what mattered most. I spent the day gathering ammunition, not just documents proving my ownership, but evidence of the HOA's shady practices. Late-night research led me to discover something shocking. Margaret and her inner circle had been skimming funds from HOA dues for years. Fake invoices, inflated contracts, even secret payouts to local officials, all neatly buried under layers of paperwork. It took hours of digging, but when I finally pieced it together, I knew I had her cornered. Armed with this new information, I called an emergency town hall meeting. This time, I set the agenda. Word spread quickly, and by the time I arrived, the room was packed again. Neighbors whispered nervously, unsure what to expect. Even Margaret showed up, flanked by her usual entourage, though she looked noticeably uneasy. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. "For weeks, you've heard lies," I began, my voice firm and steady. "You've been told that I'm threatening your homes, your community, your way of life. But let me ask you this: who's really been taking advantage of you?" I held up a stack of papers, copies of bank statements, invoices, and emails exposing the HOA's corruption. These records show that the HOA has been misusing your money, padding their pockets while pretending to act in your best interest. Does that sound like leadership to anyone here? The crowd erupted in murmurs, some voices rising in anger. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but her tone defiant. "This is slander," she snapped. Clearly, Mr. Hayes is desperate to distract from his own false claims. False claims. I shot back, holding up the deed to the subdivision itself. Here's proof that I own the land your houses sit on. Here's proof that I paid taxes on it every year. And here's proof that you've been lying to these people for years. Her composure shattered. You're bluffing, she spat, though her voice wavered. No one owns this much land. I do, I replied, locking eyes with her. And if you think I won't shut down this HOA and evict every last one of you, you're dead wrong. That hit hard. The room went silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Margaret tried to rally her supporters, but they weren't listening anymore. People started asking questions, loud, pointed ones. One neighbor stood up, holding a copy of the fake invoice I'd distributed earlier. Explain this, he demanded, shoving it toward her. Others followed suit, their voices rising in outrage. By the end of the meeting, the HOA was in shambles. Margaret stormed out, her face red with fury, while her cronies scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. As for me, I walked away feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not because I'd destroyed her, but because I'd exposed the truth. Still, the victory came at a cost. Trust had been broken, not just between me and the HOA, but within the community itself. Some neighbors thanked me. Others avoided me altogether. Rebuilding wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, because sometimes tearing things down is the only way to start fresh. And so, standing on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, I made a promise, to myself, to my land, and to the people who still called this place home. Whatever happened next, we'd face it together. The days that followed were strange. The neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret vanished almost overnight, her house empty, her car gone. Rumors swirled about where she'd fled to, but no one seemed to care enough to find out. Her reign of control had ended as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a community fractured and uncertain. For me, the aftermath was a mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated. The truth had come out, and justice, or at least some version of it, had been served. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the scars this battle had left behind. Friendships that once felt solid now felt strained. Conversations that used to flow easily were awkward, filled with unspoken tension. Even my own family wasn't immune. My kids picked up on the stress, asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. But life has a way of moving forward, even when you're not ready. Slowly, things began to change. Not all at once, but in small, meaningful ways. Neighbors who had avoided me started showing up at my door, offering apologies or simply wanting to talk. Mrs. Patel brought over a plate of homemade samosas one evening, saying she wanted to thank me for standing up against the machine. Others followed suit, bringing pies, casseroles, and jars of preserves. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. As for the land, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of keeping everything to myself, I leased portions back to local farmers and businesses. Fields that had been torn apart by bulldozers were replanted, this time with help from volunteers who showed up on weekends to pitch in. Kids ran through the meadows again, laughing and chasing butterflies like they used to. Watching them reminded me why I fought so hard in the first place, not for revenge, but for renewal. One afternoon, while I was working on repairing a fence line, a young boy approached me. He looked about 10, with dirt smudged across his cheeks and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Are you really the guy who owns all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the fields around us. I chuckled, wiping sweat from my brow. "Yeah, I guess I am." "That's cool," he said after a pause. "My mom says you saved our neighborhood." His words caught me off guard. Saved it. Was that what I'd done? Or had I just exposed the cracks that were already there? Either way, hearing those words from a child made me realize something important. Sometimes, Doing the right thing isn't about being perfect. It's about trying, even when it's hard. By the end of the year, Blue Ridge County looked different, not just physically, but emotionally. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a smaller, more transparent council elected by actual residents. Rules still existed, but they weren't enforced with an iron fist anymore. People talked openly about their concerns instead of whispering behind closed doors. And though trust took time to rebuild, the effort was worth it. Standing on the hill overlooking my farm one crisp autumn morning, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The scars were still there, the flattened crops, the broken fences, the echoes of arguments. But so was hope. Hope that the land could heal, that relationships could mend, that people could remember what it meant to truly belong to a place. Margaret thought she could crush me, but she only made me stronger. Because sometimes knowing who you are and fighting for what matters is worth more than any amount of power or property. In the end, it wasn't about owning the county or beating the HOA. It was about proving that roots run deeper than fear and that standing your ground can spark change far beyond what you ever imagined.